Today is Friday, December 20th, 2024, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson. I'm here again with my podcast co-host partner, Mr. Wallace Smith. Mr. Smith, how are we doing?
I am in a great mood. I don't know why. It's sometimes Fridays I feel like they're my most productive days, which is kind of strange because our time is a bit more scrunched. But I don't know. I'm feeling fired up, Mr. Robinson. How you feeling?
I'm in the middle. No highs, no lows.
I tell you what, I'll work to pep you up, and you work to keep me
All right.
keep me balanced.
Keep
sounds
a lid
good.
on things.
Sounds good.
That sounds good. What is our topic for this? What is it this afternoon?
What is it?
No, still
morning. Still morning. Today, and this is prompted by a number of things. In particular, I think Mr. Weston made a comment recently. I know it grabbed your attention in a sermon and stuff. So we would like to talk about the importance, dear teens and young adults, of learning to serve others. That is, making that a core part of your mindset, including not only this, but want to include very specifically serving the church, serving your congregation, serving the work. So today we're going to talk about, that's right, we're going to talk about trying to grow a heart of service in yourself.
That sounds very profitable.
Well, let's find out.
Let's cover it.
Thank you, Jake and Julia, for serving us with your skills and talents and making a little ditty for our podcast. Today, we want to talk about a very important character trait that all of us need to develop, and that is, it's not just can you serve, it's having a will to serve. It's having a desire to serve. And you may think that you don't have such a will or desire, but all these things are grown as you're working with God and with Jesus Christ. It's a matter of being shaped, not just settling for where we are. Many of you listening are teenagers. A lot of you are young adults. You talk with us, and all the more, you have an opportunity early in your life to try to work with God to instill this quality into your character, into your personality. But all the more, I want to add, I say all the more, that doesn't dominate our discussion today, but many of you are young parents who talk to us. Your children are right at that age when it's almost like your hands are in their brains. That sounds kind of disgusting, but still, you are actively shaping their character and what they decide to value in the world. And so you have a special obligation to help those children value the idea of serving other people. And so, we thought that'd be a worthwhile topic to talk about today.
You know, it's interesting because who knows if we'll ever be able to resolve the nature versus nurture. Because, my two daughters, they very clearly have a different approach to the world. But at the same time, I was genuinely amazed at how much influence I had raising them over
really.
Yeah. And certain things that might not even be considered like things that you can influence. And I mean, there was almost nothing you couldn't influence. And now that my girls are grown up, they were talking recently about, one of them said something like, I can't remember X, but I can remember all these obscure songs my dad played. And I realized we shaped a lot of what they like in music, and so anyway, the influence you have on your kids into the direction they can go is considerable.
Thank you, Mr. Robinson, for saying that. Your brilliance knows no bounds. I thank you for saying that, because it did remind me that, and I was reflecting on this, but I don't think about it enough. It's not just how we directly influence our children or are trying to influence our children. It's also how we accidentally influence them by our example. And that example can even overcome the attempts to directly influence them. And it's not even, I don't want to go too far with this, but it's not even our direct example, but our example shapes the world around us and it impacts them. And this is not directly research. That idea is directly related to today's topic in terms of growing a heart for service, because do our children see us serving and going out of our way even when it's not convenient? But in particular, in terms of the influence we have on our children, even accidentally. I had this conversation with David recently. We were in the car, I think, driving back from work or something, and we were talking about various movies, like the moment in Endgame where, if this is a spoiler for anyone, it's been out for years. I'm not going to worry about it. But where Captain America picks up Thor's hammer, I remember we saw that opening weekend that night with Mr. Sandor. Mr. Sandor was a few seats away from me, and I remember hearing him quietly say, yes, he was just really excited. And that movie was filled with so many great moments for me that you could feel your brain kind of releasing reward chemicals during parts of that movie. Well, David highlighted that. He said that even though he grew up with those movies as part of his kind of cultural background, he said none of them had the same effect as going into the theater recently to see the Godzilla -1 movie, and the moment the Japanese production company Toho, just their logo comes on the screen. He said you could feel the endorphins or the dopamine hit just seeing the logo, because he grew up watching these cheesy Japanese Godzilla movies. And even seeing the logo, he could feel the reaction in his body responding to that. And he says even watching other movies, because I think Columbia was a American distributor of such films, that even he's watching some other movie, if the Columbia logo comes on, he feels the same thing. And that's something, I didn't plan that, but just by merely making that a part of his environment, he's literally physically wired to react in a certain way. Well, that's kind of our topic today too, talking about service, because we want to focus on you serving. But at the same time, you want your kids to grow up and learn to serve, then being a servant yourself is going to be one of the key ways you do that, let alone how you actually talk to them. And I wanted to ask, because you're the one that brought this to my attention in the sense that Mr. Weston said something about that in a sermon recently. Didn't he emphasize that in some kind of way? What was it you remember?
Well, let me actually even back up a year before that,
Okay.
because otherwise his comment might not have hit the same way.
Okay.
And so a year ago, we drove back to Texas for a funeral. A relative had died right at the end of the feast on the last great day, I think. And so we went back, and she was in a different COG, and so that COG pastor did the graveside service, and afterwards we all went out to lunch. And I sat next to him, and we talked for a while. It was quite interesting. And one of the things he said was, we're really struggling to get the young people to get involved and to serve. And he meant it in the broadest way possible. Not everything from just kind of pitching in the local church area to maybe something broader like camps or something, and maybe even all the way into serving the ministry. And so recently, I think, does this sound to you like it was in the last 6 weeks? Does it sound familiar?
That does sound familiar. The sermon you're
Mr.
talking
Weston said something very similar. And I thought, I wonder if this is a theme. And, and every older generation thinks that the generations coming up behind them is the worst generation ever. Don't worry, all you millennials and others.
Yeah, we don't think that.
The baby boomers thought we were the next
That's right.
generation. That's right. So, and it really got my attention, and it seems to be a bit of a theme. And Mr. Weston's good at picking up on, he has his finger on the pulse of things, I think, pretty well. He has a good feel of what's going on in the church and what's becoming issues and what's not. And that reminded me of my own journey into learning that serving is important. So growing up in my family, you talk about influences, positive and negative. I would say that my father, you could tell, really hustled. He was a hard worker. Like whatever he attacked, he used a lot of energy. But this will sound like I'm being critical of my dad, but as a family, serving was never emphasized. And we didn't go to, when there were extra church activities, we often didn't go to them, and I didn't think of it one way or the other. I didn't know if it was good or bad. And so when I was married and then had my own kids and they started going to the preteen camps, it's the first time I really started getting pulled into serving beyond just, sure, I would do song leading and prayers, and I can't remember if by that point I was doing sermonettes or not, but the camp experience was really eye-opening to me. And I got the real taste, because look, don't judge me too harshly, everybody out there. Serving doesn't sound very fun, and I have so many more interesting things I could be doing with my time than going out and serving. But doing it at the preteen camp, I really felt the rewards. Going out there and chasing after nine little boys between the ages of 7 and 9, counting them 27 times a day to make sure you didn't lose one, and all these experiences that were difficulties, but at the end of those 4 days, you could look back and it was extremely rewarding. And in some small way, you helped those boys have a good time, and maybe even improve a little in their lives and in that experience that they had. And it really woke me up to the idea that, oh man, I'm doing a disservice to my family and the people around us and the church at large by not pitching in and trying to help and do something. And from
That's
that point forward, we were asked to help at the feast by Mr. Senna. I would give a lot of credit to friend of the podcast, Mr. Senna, for helping me get involved and really enjoy it. He was always fun to work with, and he was collaborative. And we got to the point where no matter where we were going to go to the feast, we needed to be doing something.
Oh, good.
And the feast was always better when we did some kind of service.
See, you hear that all the time. And at least I remember hearing that all the time. And I'm really grateful. My very first feast, I was pressed to serve. I was a single guy. I think I just turned 19 not long before that. And I think it was a security detail at Big Sandy walking around. And yeah, finding that it does make a difference. If there's, and of course, there's only so many roles in which to serve. And we'll talk about that, because having a heart of service doesn't necessarily mean having to have some appointed position or set aside. There's also definitely opportunities to pitch in. There's opportunities to do something. However, that resonates in so many different ways with me, because I can tend to be self-oriented. And we might say this later. I think I have it as a point, but the world is geared towards you simply focusing on yourself these days, and it's so easy to do. But also, I would, in terms of giving credit to younger generation, I do wonder if part of what we're seeing, it's difficult. I was warned a long time ago. I mean, like when I'm in my 50s, I'm talking about my 20s. I would hear about advice being given to people. You got to be careful not to sacrifice your family on the altar of the church. Well, what were they talking about specifically? They were talking about some men, like say, super deacons, we used to say, quote unquote, or some guys that their family is falling apart, and because they're not doing what they should as a father, say, or something. But that's not the same thing as seeing, and I remember Jonathan McNair talking with me about this when we moved to Ohio, and I appreciate his counsel so much about that, about seeing it as an opportunity for our whole family to serve.
Yes.
Because you can go the other way, and hopefully we'll talk about this, and start to think that, oh, well, I can't take away from my family to be able to serve, and accidentally miss what you just said, that no, actually, I'm depriving my family. This is actually a way that all of us can grow, even if it is a role that you're fulfilling. I found that my being in the ministry and us driving to different congregations and such, they didn't have to prepare a sermon or, sermonette or anything like that. And yet, by helping us together, enabling me to do what I did, kind of highlighted that this is what we all do. This is what we look for. So we'll talk about examples like that, but I think that was a spot-on thing to say. What I'd like to lead off with, because let's start big picture.
Okay.
That's the fact that learning to serve other people, learning to think outwardly, to focus on others. We'll talk about that being our family, but even beyond the family, this does not stop at the borders of the family. Learning to serve other people and learning to want to do so is at the very heart of our very purpose for existing. It's not a side thing. It is the thing. And the verse, and you might have other verses popped to mind, but I thought Matthew 20, I'm going to get there. Matthew 20 and verse.
I put it in the notes.
Oh, you did? Oh, look at you, Mr. Robinson. You got it right there. Mr. Robinson is just, he's going to say this isn't true, but he's the king of preparation when it comes to these things.
That's not true.
Yes, I knew he would say that. All right. So Matthew chapter 20, verses 27, 28, Jesus Christ is talking to his disciples, and he says, "And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave, just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many." And so he said, this is the whole reason I came, was to serve. My whole life is devoted to service. Now you might say, well, hey, I'm not looking to be first. I'm not looking to be the leader of everybody. But then you're missing the point. Our whole purpose here is to learn to be like him. And
Yes.
so if this is what he came to do, that's what we're doing by learning to serve.
I desensitize is probably not the right word, but when you grow up in the Church of God and you have a general familiarity with Christ just by going to church every week, frankly, and who he is and what he came to do, you kind of have that general sense of that. And I think it's easy to not appreciate how mind-bogglingly different Christ's approach is than mankind's approach in that respect. Well, he says close by in Matthew 20 and verse 25, he says, the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who are great exercise authority over them. In other words, what do most people in the world do? As soon as they have authority and power, that there's a mix of things. Normally, at best, you have a ruler that's looks out for you a little bit, but history, the last 6,000 years, is just replete with examples of tyrants and not good people who just take advantage. I mean, what was the most common thing in history? A very, very wealthy, small elite who was in charge, and everybody else was poor. I mean, the entire Middle Ages and what is it? The medieval system? No, what is it called?
The feudal system.
The feudal system. Just a few wealthy lords on the top, and everybody lived in poverty. And Christ came to not only not do that, but he has our best interest in mind, and he's working hard to serve us to improve our lives. I mean, that's a vast oversimplification, but he's having us improve our lives by virtue of living a godly way of life, and that's the improvement there. But he came to serve us.
Yeah.
Don't sleep on how significant that is.
I can't. I won't say the name of the comedy duo because I haven't seen all their work, and I don't know if they've got some things that are terrible or not. But this one comedy bit that was passed on to me was pretty funny. It was a guy who's a king, and his jester is entertaining him, and the king has ideas. Says, make me sad. You always make me happy, and I've never really felt being sad. My life is so wonderful, so that's what I want. And the guy's like, well, I don't know. He goes, hey, do it, or I'll kill you. He's like, oh, okay. So suddenly he's got pressure. He's got to do it, and he keeps trying to make him sad. And he says, well, king, many people in your kingdom, they're not like you. They live in poverty and they suffer. And he's like, well, yeah, but they're not me, right? I mean, that doesn't make me sad. So somehow that tied into what you just said.
Yeah, I like that.
No, thanks. But you just take. One of the things that we hope we bring to the podcast is Mr. Robinson growing up in the church, and the fact that I didn't, and it's a bit of a mix. And I would say some of those thoughts really were sort of some of that was shocking to think you're supposed to be like Christ, But, even after you are in a while and you start to hear it enough, it's easy to kind of tune those things out. But the fact is, Jesus Christ did have a very radical, his devotion to service and to others was astonishingly radical. I do think one of my favorite passages reminding us of our purpose is there in Philippians 2, where it says very blatantly in verse 5, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus. That's your whole point for taking in breath, is to try to take the mind of Jesus Christ and have Christ look at you and discover increasingly that same mind is showing up in you. And how does he describe it? Because he's not speaking broadly. He actually has something very specific in mind. He continues in verse 6, who, speaking of Christ, being in the form of God at the top of the heap, someone who, if all he wanted was to be served all day, you could do that, kind of like the king. That's what I thought about, the king in the little comedy duo. That's what he's used to. But no, that's not the way God actually is. He says, being in the form of God, didn't consider it robbery to be equal with God. That means something to be grasped at, that he had to retain it. He said, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bond servant and coming in the likeness of men. He took all that grand ability and who he was, and what did he choose to do with it? He chose to be a servant to serve all of us. You kind of go back, just putting back a bit, what is that mindset he's emphasizing? If you go back to verse 3, he tells all of us, let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind, let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. That it has to be ingrained in us, a part of who we are, which takes effort, doesn't come easily. Thinking of other people and their interests and their needs and their concerns has to be as second nature to us as thinking of our own, which comes, very easily.
Yeah, and I might also add, just on top of that it's also amazing that Christ did all this while we were at the least you could consider us passively hostile to God. In rebellion, not doing what we're supposed to do, and he still came down to serve us while we're not even doing what we're supposed to be. It would be one thing if we were like generally following the godly way and trying our best to overcome, and then he, can't come and serves us and helps us even more. No, we're not cooperative. We're not thankful. I mean, look, the religious leaders of his time killed him because he was harsh in their vibe. I mean, they wanted to be in charge. They're going to lose their name and their place. The Romans are going to come in and overthrow us if this guy keeps gaining popularity. We'll lose everything. And so just the sacrifice that Christ made to serve us is such an amazing example we can point to. Now, you correct me if I'm wrong here. I was talking to my wife. She says the Daily Wire Plus has the next series. That they did an Exodus series, and now they're doing the Gospels.
Oh, interesting.
And
Really?
her general impression of it is they should have stuck with Exodus because the Gospels has been poor. And one of the whole topic they pondered was why did Christ get baptized?
Really?
Yeah,
Like
they really
confused
struggled
on
with
that.
it. Yep. And,
That's fascinating.
And it reminded me of the fact that this is where you might have to fact check me.
Okay, I'll do my best.
Anything that Christ has asked us to do, he himself did during his ministry. He kept all the holy days. He fasted. He had nothing that he needed to be cleansed from in the baptism process, but he did it as an example to us. And he expects us to do it, and he did it. And of course, he didn't need a savior because he's literally the savior. But all the expectations of our behavior, he himself acted out and went through. I say acted out makes it sound fake, but I just meant he went through the process and did it.
Yes, Mr. Robinson, I've done a little study in that in terms of looking at the titles that exist. I just did a Bible study on God's government of the church, and some time before I looked at all the different titles of that there is in terms of like a apostle and such, and find that they all apply even to Jesus Christ in some kind of way. He's called the chief shepherd, right? You know, but in many ways, even deacon, which boils down to kind of being servant of something, you see diakonos, the Greek word applied to Christ, and also I would say that because otherwise, if he asks us to do something, we say, well, Christ, you have no idea what this is like, right? Well, no, that's not the case. Paul really emphasizes in Hebrews that we have someone who sympathizes with our every weakness. There's nothing he asks us to do that he doesn't have complete sympathy with, because in some way it's reflected, in terms of what he's done.
I mean, what he says in Hebrews is so profound. This is one of the few things that I never think of myself as a particular deep thinker that really meditates on something deep. And this is one of the things that I have found kind of amazing, that Christ himself learned something by going through the process of suffering and dying on the cross, and that he was pleased to do it because he understood what the implications were in a way we didn't. Well, we do better now, but anyway, that he even learned something by going through the same human process and suffering is quite remarkable.
Right, and he did come and was, as we read, I think also in Philippians there, how he divested himself of his divine prerogatives, which meant he went through life like we are. I mean, he did have God's Spirit, but yet all the things that we've faced, he did face. And even in that context, what did he choose to do? Serve, serve, serve. You're right, with the example of baptism. Like John the Baptist say? He's like, well, I should be baptized by you. Yes, what are you talking about? And he says, no, permit it to be so for righteousness' sake, because he was modeling for us everything that we would need to do. I completely agree.
So what do you see out there as some of the roadblocks or the reasons that we sometimes fail to get as involved as we should and also serve when maybe it's not even intentional. It's not, you're not actively going, you know what, the last thing I'm going to do, it's serve. No, we get distracted with things in our life and things get in the way. What do you see out there that's a very natural thing we go through that distracts us and prevents us from serving at times?
That's a great question, Mr. Robinson. And there are a lot of things, and it might vary from person to person. Mr. Weston has highlighted, and I don't think this was the same sermon. I think it was an earlier sermon, but when he was encouraging all of us to think in terms of serving others. In fact, it might have been right after the recent terrible disaster, really, there in Asheville with the hurricane, and not just Asheville. I keep saying Asheville. There's people not in Asheville saying, "Hey, what about us?" That whole region there, because he highlighted that when it comes to actually serving others, that the best times never really come when it's convenient for us, right? It always comes at inconvenient times. In fact, if it is convenient for us, still serve, but at the same time, what God is looking for is when it does take some effort. And yet the world, so there's convenient times when you have free time. There's other inconvenient times when you don't have free time. And yet, even our free time, the world has found a way, I would say, with the current level of social media interaction, things like that. How do I put this? If you imagine, I wish I did more physical kind of labor in a way that I know this. There's things, let me know. There's like epoxies and things you put down in something that might fill all the gaps and cracks to make it perfectly smooth, like a nice wooden table. And there's various coatings you put on to where You go from a wooden table that's beautiful. It's a little rough in places. It's got some cracks here, but next thing you know, you put this on it and there's not a crack or space, and it's beautiful. Well, the reverse like that happens with our time. Naturally, you would have times. You'd have time slow down. Mr. Robinson said a while ago he doesn't think of himself as a deep thinker. I would say he may not sit around and meditate, like some guy by the fire, but I appreciate Mr. Robinson's deep thinking. But we have times when it's a little easier to think than other times, and yet we've been trained by social media to fill it, even in the most minute ways. And that also includes in terms of serving. There's so many ways in which we could do more to serve. And yet, and it's not just a matter of time. I'm actually getting to the real point. By teaching us to fill that time with social media here and there, social media has a secondary effect. Social media is an entire entertainment world, if you will, that teaches you that you're what's most important. The books you want to read, the feeds you want to hear from, the people who tweet on Twitter, the people who post on Instagram. If you think about it, social media is the most you-oriented entertainment or interaction medium that has ever been created. And the side effect is that we as a people do tend to think of ourselves. We tend to think of our needs. We start giving what we need a real priority over others. In fact, my daughter-in-law, Isabel, was watching an analysis of I think it's Netflix, I'm not sure, but it was an adaptation of Jane Austen's, which was it? It's one of her books. And it's not Pride and Prejudice. It's not I can't think of it. Anyway, regardless.
I'm like everybody else. Here's what I know of Jane Austen, that she did Pride and Prejudice.
It's not Emma. It's not Pride and Prejudice. It's not Sense and Sensibility. It's this other one.
You need to text your daughter-in-law.
I know she listens to the podcast, and right now she's probably screaming at the podcast, it's this, and I can't remember. I'll try to look it up in a minute. However, the Netflix take was disappointing in a lot of ways, because they not only tried to modernize it in certain ways, but modernize it in ways that actually completely changed some of the characters. And one of the things I think her review she was watching mentioned is they took certain characters and made them start to comment on how they need to do self-care. They need to focus.
Wow.
And that is so much a part of our culture now. Now, part of it's because we've created a culture where no one cares for anybody else anymore. And if you're not doing self-care, maybe nobody's taking care of you. But it's human instinct to want to take care of ourselves. And I'm not saying there's healthier practices that people can learn, but we have a culture around us that is more focused, is where I get to the point, more focused on empowering you to serve yourself.
Yes.
That as a result, you don't have any more gas in the tank to even think serve other people. And yet, akin to what you said about the feast, Mr. Robinson, you do find that when you do serve other people, it is amazing how much you end up growing yourself. It is amazing how much you end up being also built up yourself.
And God gives us like the perfect, go figure, right? The perfect way of life to live. And so many of our lessons are embedded in the family. And growing up, finding the one for you, getting married. There's a particular author, I think he's from Canada, and he's just quoting what other people have said. Then there's an old saying that you never really grow up until you have to take care of somebody else. And getting married starts that process. And I have to admit, I'll be honest, I've been very honest on this podcast in the past. I did not serve my wife as well as I should when we were first married, because my viewpoint was selfish, and I viewed my wife as more completing my life, and I wasn't thinking in terms of helping to complete her life. Now, I wasn't entirely selfish, and I did things for her, but especially as we started having kids, man, if you learn a lot about serving by raising a family. As dad, you really have to get in there and do your part and serve your family and serve your children. And, that's a whole longer discussion to talk about what that looks like. But the family is a great place to learn about serving, because, a family that's constructed around my mom or a dad or both that aren't as invested in their family as they ought to be, that's a recipe for having a lot of family trouble and drama. The mom and dad serve great. The moms, they're the easiest ones to look at, having these babies and caring for them because they're so helpless. I'm always in awe of their patience and doing all of it. But the family, Great
Okay.
step.
Before I gotta say for my daughter-in-law's sake, at least, I think it's Persuasion. I think Jane Austen's story was the story Persuasion. And yes, let's talk about the.
I don't
I
blame
love
you.
her. I got to serve her. I
Yeah.
gotta say, hey, don't worry, Isabel. I got it. Now, let's hope I got it right. Otherwise, she's there thinking, no, it's not
Well,
that. But I do think that's it.
that since we're back on that for a second, Anne of Green Gables,
Oh,
Netflix
yeah.
redid it, and I think the first season was. My impression was it was okay, even though they were clearly manipulating the story. But season 2 was like, surprise! Here's what we really want to do, and it was the perfect example of taking a modern mindset and putting it on these people that, a story from what, at least 100 years ago, late 1800s maybe.
I think so. Right? Maybe Margaret Mead, I think, wrote that. I'm not sure. That's the name.
And it just rebuilt everything, and it was so frustrating, and it kind of undermined the very purpose of telling the story to begin with.
Yeah, that was kind of part of the comment was, if this is the kind of characters they wanted to have, and this is the motivation they want to have, why not make your own story? Yeah. Why not? Well, because you're hoping people will watch just because of Jane Austen. All right. So with that in mind, how do we learn this selflessness? How do we learn to focus on other people? Mr. Robinson hit it. The family. God designed the family. That alone is reason enough to want to do it the way he describes. But if you really do look at the picture, it's he designed the family to teach us service, to teach, okay, for other reasons. We have to perpetuate mankind. We have to have babies, and those babies have to have babies. And of course, it's picturing the God family, but again, the God family is about service. Among the things that the purpose of the family serves, it teaches us how to serve so many others, not just the family. And each position in the family has a kind of service role. I thought it'd be good to kind of talk about them in the most obvious ways. And some may not think this is obvious based on modern sensibilities, but let's start with children. Your children, it should be natural that they have a serving role in the family. Now, that said, it doesn't mean we have children to have them serve us all the time. But at the same time, this modern idea that once you have children as parents, the best thing you can do is sacrifice literally everything else in the world to make your children as happy as possible does them a disservice and produces monsters as they get older. The fact is, if parents are properly educating their children, then they are teaching them to serve. There are chores that the children should do. There's responsibilities that children should have. The burdens of the family overall should be shared with the children. As they get older, they can wash dishes. They can help prepare dinner. They can mow the lawn. I know I sure loved having kids old enough to be able to mow the lawn. This idea that somehow children should be, no, we should just kind of do everything for them and they do nothing.
Right.
That's how you produce terrible children.
No, I mean, I've seen some really good examples of this in the past, and I don't even know that I did it all that well, but like early on, get the kids involved in what the family's doing, find age appropriate tasks that they can do, and just, you're right. It really starts when they're very young. In my experience, I actually have a YouTube channel I watch occasionally, and it's this farmsteading family, and they have, I think
I've heard you mention that,
4 acres. And I'm actually, side note, I'm amazed what you can do with only 5 acres. Like, you really could, if you had decent land and access to water and things like that. Of course, we still use some modern things, but you can grow what your family needs and actually have a pretty robust food setup on only 5 acres. But I digress. And one of the things I've appreciated about watching some of their videos is the kids are out there with them doing stuff. They're out helping weeding. They're teaching them how to care for the animals. They got a lot of chickens, and then recently one where they're separating the beans from their stalk. And anyway, it was kind of funny too. Saying we're gonna have to do a whole new podcast. They have all these beans and they put them in a pillow, and you pound them with the pillow. And it separates just the right amount of pounding, because you can overpound or not pound enough. And it does a good job of separating the husks from the beans. And then he takes the beans and he puts them in a bowl. And then he fires up a big fan, and you pour from one bowl into the other, and it blows away the chaff. I mean, it got biblical real in her. Since none of us, well, I shouldn't say none of us. I know that David Wakefield actually literally grows and harvests wheat. And you all you really want is the seed out of that, and so you got to separate and you got to blow it apart. Sorry,
No,
but they had the
that's
kids
awesome.
in there doing it. The kids were actually ideal for sifting through and finding loose beans that had
Really?
gone out, and they liked doing it, and they kind of had it made a game out of it. And I think there's so many ways you can get your kids involved, and that's fun.
Oh, that's great. I would say it doesn't have to just be limited to the immediate family, extending to grandparents. I remember going over to my grandmother's house, and she was one of those. She had a lot of fresh beans, green beans from the grocery or wherever she got them. Actually, probably my grandfather. He grew a lot. And you had to snap them
Yep.
and deal with them. And as a kid, that's boring. But, in the end, there's so many times like when I think, oh, I wish I knew a little bit more about my grandmother, grandfather. And yet those were times when you're just there snapping
Yep.
beans and you are gaining from it.
Yep.
And yet, you know what? It helps remind you sometimes things have to be done
Yep.
and you need
That's
to
right.
help do them,
Well, and I like the farm analogy because it also not only teaches the kids how to serve within the family by helping the family, but it teaches them responsibility. Like you have a responsibility to get out there and feed such and such an animal or go collect the eggs or whatever. And I would imagine as a young child that the hens were not the hens, the roosters were terrifying, but that doesn't matter. You got to serve your family, get out there, get those eggs.
Yeah, we'll come back to teaching kids in a moment as things extend. But what you just said, that's one of the main reasons we had ferrets for a while. A couple of ferrets named Boba and Django.
As they
Ferret,
should be.
yeah, as it should be. Anyway, but one of the reasons we did is we wanted the boys to have some young animal, if you was not young, but that they'd have to learn. Okay, this is depending on you. You actually have to do things to help care for an animal, and that was service. So not all of us are going to be homesteaders. But yes, parents, whatever environment in which you find yourselves, it is worthwhile finding ways for your children to serve. And there's a broader way about that we'll look at. But right now we're just kind of focusing inside the family. Let's kind of scale things up to the wife. I want to go from obvious to less obvious for some. And especially in this day and age, they don't necessarily see a difference in terms of the wife's role versus, say, the husband's role. If anything, the world is trying to tell us that why should there be any difference? Right. That is not the Bible's take. In Titus, for instance, when Paul is talking about how older men need to teach younger men such and such, and older women need to teach younger women such and such, he says here in this passage, starting in verse 3 of Titus 2, he says, the older women likewise, and likewise means they should be teaching the younger women. He said, well, actually, let me jump to verse 4 where he starts getting into the younger women. He says in verse 4, he says that they should admonish the younger women to love their husbands, to love their children, to be discreet, chaste, homemakers, good, obedient to their own husbands, that the word of God not be blasphemed. That phrase there, homemakers, is translated in different ways, but the thing is they all end up meaning the same thing. I look like the old King James Version used to say keepers at home. The New English translation says fulfilling their duties at home, that there's an obligation there to fulfill. Is that an obligation? Yes, go back all the way to Genesis. In Genesis, when Eve was created, she was described as a helper. Mm-hmm. We often say a helpmeet, like it's kind of one thing, but the whole full phrase was that she was a help meet for him, a help that was comparable to him. So not just to help for her own desires and duties, but actually someone who was custom made to be fit to him, to be a helper for him. And the world works hard to make women resent that idea of being a homemaker, but that is the devil's world speaking to you, young ladies. That's not God.
Go on. Well, I've so a couple things. One thing we have to realize is that this modern era that we currently live in is very, very different than how most people grew up, or the life experience they had over the last 6,000 years. The modern conveniences that we have, cars, labor-saving devices, all these different things really have made it so that women can have a life without a man, because instead of your husband kind of looking after you and protecting you, you can call the police. You can go to college and get a university degree and have a job that doesn't require you to be physical. There's lots of jobs like that. But in the past, it was not so. We don't have to go back further than the whole area of Little House on the Prairie. And that's where you start to realize how amazing God designed the family. So, you have dad out there. He's bigger. He's stronger. He enjoys the harder work. And I shouldn't see, I'm already stepping into it. Harder work. Maddie was telling me when she read the Little House on the Prairie books, all of them when she was a kid, she says back in that time, there was always an ongoing debate about who worked harder, the men or the women.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I thought that was interesting because that's probably the right answer. It's like, yes, it was both. The men
That's
had
right.
more backbreaking, heavy work, but the women tended to do work that wasn't as difficult. Like the men wouldn't have trouble
Like
with it,
physically
but for
difficult, right?
physically, it was demanding for them. And the division of duties, with men being more external and the women more internal, to keep. And like, if you're a man and you're out, get the crops in the field, and you're literally behind two oxen yoked together, plowing through a field,
Yeah.
chopping down trees, making sure there's enough wood. You kind of need somebody back home looking after the kids and seeing if we can get the food on the table, because, and if you had to do all of that yourself, I mean, that's impossible.
Right.
And the wife is ideally suited for that role, and that's the way she was created.
That is exactly the way she was designed. We have a sermon on that, the design of woman, I think is what I titled it. But yeah, the world is working so hard, Mr. Robinson, to make young women, any women, resent that idea that God has actually designed roles in the family. But I tell you, I know Mr. Robinson will agree with me on this. That's why we do podcasts together. We know we agree on these things, which is that a wife and a mother who embraces the role that God has designed for in the family, it is a beautiful thing. It is something that actually is a wonder, and it humbles you to see, and it accomplishes so much.
Yeah, 100%.
And so the wife's role, definitely a role of service. Now, then we get to the husband. And the reason I said we're going to order it in terms of the obvious way, because people often say, oh, I bet he doesn't change many diapers, or I bet he doesn't do these things. Well, and that's because, one, it's often true. Secondly, it's because we're kind of following the opposite thing, where, like you were saying, you characterize the man's work as harder. And the world these days wants to say, no, boy, it's that woman toiling away at home that's harder. The man has it so easy. It's the patriarchy. It's just got him on a throne where he's just served constantly. Well, don't get me wrong. There definitely could be some men that do that, and shame on them, because that's not what God called them to. The husband's supposed to picture Christ. Christ is not just living it up in heaven, eating chicken pot pies all the time and watching television. That Christ is working on behalf of his bride, which is the church. The husband also must serve. He is the head of the household. But what did we read earlier from Matthew chapter 20, I think? The one who actually is the chief must serve the most. He is the one that has to be pouring himself the most. If you want to be in charge, then you have to plan on serving. That does not mean what this world wants, because the world wants to say there's no distinction in the roles, that the husband must wash half the dishes, do half the diapers, do all. That's like saying there's no roles whatsoever. Now, maybe in your family you like that. In fact, who knows? Maybe there's husbands out there that's a calming time for them. They know their wife is slaved away, and so they're going to do the dishes. Often the boys did the dishes. I'm trying to pitch in more just to do the dishes because I do appreciate it. But that said, that is not what we are saying. There are ways in which men uniquely serve the family that if you're a husband, you have to you have to think of yourself, I'm in charge. Then what does that mean? It means I serve.
Yes.
My job empowers me to serve. What the money I earn empowers me to serve. The time that my wife gives me by having made this wonderful meal should have enabled me to serve in some kind of way. The husband's role is one that is serving. Like in our family, my wife did a lot of the homeschooling, right? And then thankfully my in-laws moved in, and my mother-in-law was able to help in that way too. I'm so grateful that she did that. She set the tone with the boys, and she set the purpose. And again, my mother-in-law moved in and did more of the same. Well, did I still have any role? Yes, I had a role. So my wife and I would talk about it, and my role was to lead and to guide and to help enable it, help to make it work. She wanted to be able to travel with me, which homeschooling enabled us to do, which was wonderful. If I have to travel to serve in some kind of way, we didn't do it all the time, but did it more frequently than many would be able to. And so I need to communicate with her. She has to be able to plan. She has to know, is this a day that I can grab the boys and the books and what they've got to read and do? So I had a role even in that thing. It was unique for her, but there's times she wanted to be able to escalate a problem to me because the burden of trying to solve this shouldn't be on her. And so she escalated that to me, and I could take a look at it.
Yep.
In terms of discipline, She definitely disciplined the boys, my wife. But there's also times when she knew, you know what, this is a dad level
Yeah.
discipline.
I
She
mean,
needs to escalate
there's a
that.
reason. There's the whole wait until your dad gets home thread out there because
That's right. And, especially, I don't know, I'm sure it's true with some girls too, but I didn't get the chance to raise girls. I got the chance to raise boys. And there are times with boys, she would wonder, as she'd say, I have dealt with this until I'm blue in the face, whether the paddle and spoon's been brought out, whatever, this or that. And there's times when just a word from me would have such an impact that she could not have produced all day. And that's not because the kids are uniquely rebellious, because they love their mother, they respected her. But sometimes dad makes a difference.
I still feel like I remember pretty well. Like I know how I was as a little boy, and I like to get away as much as I could. And while you couldn't, I had some fear for my mom, but I still was always kind of running around the edges, seeing what I could get away with. But when she started invoking dad, it was like, okay, it's time to get serious. Well, we might want to dial it back a little bit. We don't want to get to that level.
Yeah.
And that's I had. This is at my old job more than 12 years ago now, and a couple of the women there, because it was the front office was naturally, like most places, a mix of men and women. And they would what was it? They liked how they felt like I did a good job supporting my wife, and that it was nice to be able to escalate to the man when necessary. Well, maybe I don't know about last thing if you have something else, but on this notion. Mary Harrington that I mentioned before, she's a British author. She calls herself a reactionary feminist, but more to the point, she's kind of a feminist against progress. Like, she doesn't think the modern way of
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. But she says, and her friend Louise Perry also has said, both of them in their own ways. She says, look, when a woman becomes pregnant, she's the most vulnerable she can be until she has the baby, where she's the most vulnerable. And as they both have said, it's like when you're caring for an infant, that you devote all your resources to that, and somebody's got to be there to look after everything else and put food on the table, and that's the husband and the dad. And like, it just makes natural sense. Why we want to fight against it and try to do it some other way is just kind of mind-boggling.
It is amazing to see some of these people that would normally be kind of on the left when it comes to social issues, not trying to be political, kind of rediscover things God taught from the beginning. To sum this up, yes, even the husband role, ignore all these lies about the patriarchy and stuff. There's people that abuse their roles at every level, but husbands, they're described in Ephesians chapter 5, verse 25 and 26. It says, husbands, love your wives just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her. And you can read the other two verses on your own, but what's the summary? That is a self-sacrificial role. The husband role is not a serve me role. It is a I sacrifice myself, for the family and the needs of others. Okay, now that said, we've talked about the family. It is very easy, though, to turn the family into an idol, because the purpose of the family is not just to teach us to serve each other and be inward focused. What does Paul tell, I think it's Timothy later? He says, how do you know how to serve the old men with your advice, and what you do it like you serve your father? How do you know how to serve and work with old women like you would your mother and your siblings? The family is meant to prep us for serving other people. And if we don't seek to expand our serving beyond our family, we're missing the point. And this is kind of an obscure verse. It's not really obscure, I guess. Well, there are obscure verses, but there's something that I remember the first time I read it and it jumped out at me. I may have read it before, but it jumped out at me in a different way, talking about thinking, how outward thinking should we be? And it was Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 28. And it's easy to miss this little point here, but it says in Ephesians 4 and verse 28, let him who stole steal no longer. He's dealing with a bunch of deadbeats in the church. He's saying, stop being a deadbeat, get off your bottom and do some work, do something. It's the same kind of thinking. He's like, hey, if you don't work, don't eat. It's the way it is. But in verse 28, he says, let him who stole steal no longer, but rather let him labor, working with his hands what is good. Now, if you stop there, that's profitable by itself. Yes, learn to work with your hands and have a work ethic. Don't steal from other people. But he goes further and says, why do that? Why work? Why work with your hands? Why is labor good? He says that he, the person who's changing, may have something to give him who has need. And I remember when that part finally hit me, because I got the work ethic thing, and I felt, I need to work. But to realize why am I earning a salary? Why am I working? It's because I need to be thinking there are other people that have need. There's needs out there, and I've got to be ready to fulfill them. And, it's hard to fill a need when you don't earn enough money. When we bought a house, one of the things we kind of thought of is let's get a house that we want. But how, and I credit my wife with this. I need to be honest. This is not just me. My wife says these things. Oh, thank you, baby, for making me a better man. In what way can we use this house in difficult times to help other people, right? Whether it's our family, somebody. And that mindset is what God is looking for. Learning to serve inside the family is not just about staying in the family. We have to be able to devote that to learning to serve other people. And so that's when I said I'd come back to teaching our children. We don't just teach our children to serve us. If we really want to seal the deal, we have to be focused on teaching our children to serve other people. The congregation is the natural place to do that. Again, I'm bragging on my wife a good bit, hopefully in this, because I've really been shaped by her. I could be very naturally selfish. And there's two things I know, these are kind of it might seem like, I don't think they're extreme, but examples that she inspired us to do with our kids I really liked. One of them was at a feast. She tried to highlight to them, hey, there's elderly people here. Just because you're a little kid doesn't mean you can't try to make their day. And so she got like a bunch of flowers. They might have, I think they were roses. They might have been carnations. And she told each of them, hey, today I've got the flowers. I want you to go find an elderly woman in the congregation and give them a flower, and tell them to have a great feast or something. And so they did all of that. I have a story about that. I want to say it was Benjamin. I could be wrong. It kind of makes sense. But, Benjamin, because the kids, they're not really playing, they're really little, and so they're giving them to different ladies. And one lady said she'd already gotten one from one of the other boys at the feast, and so Benjamin, I think it's Benjamin, if not, I apologize, Benjamin, for saying this to you, but he gives the lady the flower, and she goes, oh, well, thank you, but I've already got one. And he goes, oh, that's okay, we're giving them to all the old ladies here.
Oh boy.
And I only know that because she told me, and she did not seem offended. Thankfully, she still appreciated it. But that, and then also I would credit it with the boys who they enjoy dancing at dances, because early when they were little, honest, I'll be straight up, we bribed them. We wanted them to know there was a reward for good activity. And I can't remember if it was a nickel or a dime, or because my wife was the one that put the scheme together. And when they were little, she said, hey, for every female you take onto the dance floor and dance with them, we'll give you a quarter, we'll give you whatever it is. And she, because they were little kids, she would tell them, and older ladies count, like grandmothers and stuff, because sometimes that's less intimidating for a kid. And this is this is like preteen camp days, even earlier in some cases. And so it got them in. So now we don't have to do that, because they learned it was enough for them to realize, if I'm at a dance, that's what I'm there to do. I'm there to try to show some of the ladies a good time. It's about serving the other people. So credit to her, because I wouldn't have thought those things. But the point about learning to serve is not, even in the family, it's not to focus on the family. It's to focus on the congregation, focus outward, focus on the church more broadly. How can I serve? What can I do?
And I think another good example, church related, is camps. As I mentioned earlier, I was always really impressed. There were a lot of kids that went through the teen camp system, and then when they're 18, 19, whatever, the cutoff has varied. Many of them came back as staff, and I heard so many say this, hey, I had such a great time at camp, I wanted to come back and serve. So when I'm sure there's a mix of things. Sometimes maybe you come back as staff because that sounds like way more fun. but a lot said to serve, and that they wanted to give back, and I always really appreciated that. That also reminds me of something that I don't remember.
That's the worst thing to be reminded of, is something that you can't remember. Yeah. Well, let me share an anecdote related to that, and if it comes up, then we'll talk about it. I remember, and I got this idea. It wasn't this exact idea, but the impetus was from Mr. Jonathan McNair. When I was running the preteen camp in Missouri, he had come to check on it and visit once, and give some advice. And he had talked about the role of ritual and custom and trying to build that into a program. So we didn't pull it off very well the first year, but then the second year I liked it much better. I wanted that idea. I wanted the preteens to think, hey, one day I could come back and I could help and I could do something. So I took all of our staff that had been campers before. I think Tyler Wayne was there one year. I did that, and I think Denon was there. Others that had been there, and I had the staff who had been campers before line up on one side, and then the 12-year-olds. It was a preteen camp on the other side, and it had kind of a graduation ceremony where they kind of the lines passed each other and they shook each other's hands, And I know it was something, and it was kind of corny, but I wanted to get that picture across that here's guys that were just where you were, and look at where they are now. They're helping you, have a good camp.
Mr. Jonathan McNair, he really has. It's really on his mind about camp and teaching kids how to serve, and it's interesting because, if you come back as staff, that's something of a leadership role, and leadership means responsibility. You have a responsibility, and the way that responsibility is manifested more often than not is by serving. I think that's in the church we have a much better sense of this, but out in the world, I don't think there's enough understanding that leadership or oversight is actually much more of a responsibility than everything else. And when you have a responsibility, that means you're taking care of other people, which means on some level you are serving them.
100%. As we kind of move towards a concluding sort of statement, I'd like to highlight the congregation as a great place for that. You can have, if your pastor asked you to do something, try to lean in towards saying yes. There may be solid reasons for saying no. Like if he needs you on something on Sundays and you have to work all day Sundays, you certainly can't, right? At the same time, try to take advantage of those opportunities. If God has moved your pastor to ask you to do something and it's within your ability to do, lean towards jumping in, but also not waiting for that. Now, it doesn't mean making roles for yourself, but you know what? There are people in your congregation that in your children's that your children don't know or you don't know as well. There's something about a young man coming up and asking an older person how their week was. It's doing those kinds of things where you learn, well, you know what? Mr. So-and-so needs his lawn mowed more regularly. Mrs. So-and-so is a widow and she's moving in 2 weeks to a new apartment or something. Right. And it's when you teach your children and you yourself, that's part of the example. You have to do these things yourself. When that's kind of happening, that's how you learn for those opportunities. That's when God actually has an opportunity to say, oh, I've been wanting someone to help Miss So-and-so move. I'm so glad young Mr. So-and-so is talking with her. And you have to have that orientation towards service. But if you have that orientation, God can make opportunities. It may not be the most glamorous opportunity because that's not what serving is. If we're only looking for the glamorous opportunity, we're looking to be served by the opportunity, and that's not what we're talking about.
I will say there is a flip side to this. Flip is probably too strong, but there is another side to this, which was, and my brother-in-law, Sean Dumas, had a similar sense. We were both worried at times, and I'm talking about us as like late 20s, early 30s men, married men in the church, and we're worried about being presumptuous, like jumping in to help in a way that's like,
well, who do you think you are?
Yeah,
why are you doing that?
Exactly. And Mr. I talked about that with Mr. Senna again. This is another Mr. Senna episode, and he's like, no, I can understand that, but like, if there's something that could just be done, just pitch in and do it. And pitching in where you can to help out is a very Christ-like attitude.
Yeah, it is. It's what Christ is looking for in us. Maybe you discover that Mrs. Widow so-and-so needs to move. That's also a great opportunity to mention to the pastor, hey, Mrs. So-and-so is moving. I plan on showing up to help her. He might want to put a work party together. At least it makes him make sure he's aware, but that's not an excuse to do nothing. But right, we don't want to be presumptuous, but having a heart of service is not a matter of being presumptuous.
Yep.
And so use it as an opportunity to serve yourself.
But there is a balance though, because you are right. And I hate to say it, but over the 30 plus years of my adult life, I have seen more than one person seems to be the purpose of serving is more to be seen than to actually serve. So there is that. So there is a time when you step past a bound and into an area that wasn't maybe something you were supposed to take care of But at the same time, it can also be paralyzing, which is what I found. I was so paranoid about stepping outside my bounds and being presumptuous that I think there were times I could have maybe taken care of something and I didn't. Because
Interesting. Kind of like the fearfulness of that. At least that's an appropriate, I say fearfulness. It's an appropriate thing to be concerned about. But if you're seeking it sincerely, then and you have adults in your life. I say adults. We're also talking to adults, your pastor and such. Then just be open to that. Be open to the idea of someone saying, "Hey, thank you for wanting to bring food," or so and so. But we've got someone doing that, and as long as you're not in it for yourself, then if anything, you'd be delighted to know that's already being taken care of. Right? So I appreciate the warning there, Mr. Robinson. I thought we'd wrap up with a verse, and sure enough, Mr. Robinson's got it right there in the notes. What a man! I only got to look it up. Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8. In Isaiah chapter 6, we have the tale of really the calling of Isaiah to his prophetic job. And first, Isaiah feels unworthy, right? Like the opposite of presumption. Like you're talking about, he feels, I'm a man of unclean lips. How could I even speak to the Lord or on his behalf? And so there's this cool thing. The angel takes tongs and a coal and touches it to his lips, and his lips have been purified. And then in the next verse, he is essentially he essentially responds like you see Abraham respond, like you see Samuel respond in the same way when God shows up with a job. It says in Isaiah chapter 6 and verse 8, he says, I heard the voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Then I said, "God, I'm way too busy. Call somebody else." That's not what he said. That's not what he said. He said,
I was just about to stream a movie on Netflix.
I set you up, right? He says, then I said, here am I, send me. It's like he was ready to serve.
I love that.
It's just beautiful. Yeah. And I think there's even some special music out there where that's been woven into
Audrey
music.
and I'm serious. We quote that to each other not infrequently.
Really?
I can't even think of an example of where it comes up that we would say that to each other, but we say it all the time. I love that.
And if you think about it, he was not volunteering for a glamorous job. And yes, he's been recorded for all history. But man, the prophets had it rough. This was not necessarily something, but here am I, send me. We may not always serve in all the ways we want to. In fact, God is merciful enough to us to make sure that we don't. We serve in a lot of different ways. But the key is to start with a heart that wants to say yes. Yeah. Learn to build a heart that wants to say yes to opportunities to serve, that the first thought isn't, here's the reasons I can't, but can I find a way where I can? Whether it's reevaluating my priorities, reevaluating what's going on in my life, reevaluating what it means to be busy. Can I find, sometimes you won't be able to, and that's just the way it is. Then you can let someone else serve. But having a heart that's oriented towards saying, here am I, send me, I want to serve, we've got to start with that.
Yes. This to bookend this and bring this around, it gets to the very heart of our calling.
It does.
What are we called to do? We've used this example on the podcast before. My mother-in-law asked me that once, and I kind of mumbled something pathetic, and she says, "No, you're called to do the work." Mr. Armstrong just really emphasized that with us, and it's our modern convenient lives can make us soft, and we don't want to be pushed out of our comfort zone, and maybe we don't want to be inconvenienced by something. But man, if you're called to do the work, that has a very broad meaning when you understand all the aspects of it, and to get an opportunity to serve within the church, to serve future members of God's family, that's a real honor that we should not let get past us.
Smith and Robinson.